It is precisely because citizens and civil society can be so powerful that more and more governments are doing everything in their power to silence them.
Nicolás Maduro is a dictator with no legitimate claim to power. He's never won the presidency in a free and fair election, and he's maintained his grip of power by imprisoning anyone who dares to oppose him.
From Venezuela, you are seeing relentless crackdowns vilifying legitimate dissent as subversive. We stand in solidarity with those who are detained at this very moment.
Venezuela is experiencing the worst economic crisis of its history. Political and social chaos engulf what was once one of Latin America's most prosperous societies. An estimated 3 million migrants have fled the country, nearly 10% of Venezuela's population. Of those who remain, nearly 90% live in poverty. Despite severe shortages of medicine and food, Maduro has often denied that a humanitarian crisis even exists.
Toda la campaña que se ha hecho de migración en Venezuela se ha exagerado. Venezuela es un país receptor de migrantes. Yo les digo que ustedes han montado un estereotipo en la BBC de Londres, en los medios estadounidenses también, de una Venezuela que no existe.
Hundreds of thousands are now protesting against Maduro's government, and the military's response has caused hundreds of deaths. The United States and European Union imposed sanctions on Venezuelan officials, including freezing their assets and canceling visas. The US recently imposed sanctions on Venezuela's oil, blocking $18 billion in oil transactions. Maduro doesn't appear to be backing down. Just a few years ago, Venezuela was once hailed by many as the poster child for successful democratic socialism.
The president of Venezuela is leading the struggle to build that socialism here in our 21st century.
But now the government is widely criticized as a totalitarian regime and dictatorship, and President Maduro's legitimacy as president is under fire. Maduro was appointed president after Hugo Chavez died in 2013, but when Maduro was re-elected in 2018, his election was considered a fraud because it failed to meet international standards of freedom and fairness. This began in 2015, 2 years before his re-election, when the opposition won a supermajority in the Venezuelan Congress. Maduro responded by creating a separate legislature. Loyalists won all 545 seats in the new assembly and gave itself the power to rewrite the nation's constitution and fire dissident state officials, stripping the original legislature of its powers. This sparked massive protests in the country who viewed the new assembly as blatantly unconstitutional. Maduro made it easier to silence critics by exiling and arresting opposition party members. These actions caused Maduro's popularity to wane during the economic crisis, and his approval rating decreased to 20%. However, with the most popular opposition leaders barred from elections, it didn't matter. 8 months after his re-election, Maduro's presidency was challenged. The president of the opposition majority National Assembly, Juan Guaidó, declared on January 23rd that he was the new president interim. When Guaidó first began pushing the Venezuelan military to recognize him, and not Maduro as a legitimate leader, he was arrested by the government police. It wasn't long after his release that Guaidó said he would assume the presidency on an interim basis in order to call free elections. His interim presidency received widespread international support, including most of the European Union, the United States, and the majority of Venezuela's neighbors in South America.
Trascendente misión de poder avanzar hacia la recuperación de la democracia, del Estado de Derecho, de las libertades en un país hermano como Venezuela.
But you also need the army to be involved. That's what Juan Guaidó has been asking for all day, for the army to back him, and so far, we're not sure if that's going to happen.
Conozco al diputado Juan Guaidó como presidente encargado de la República Bolivariana de Venezuela. A mis compañeros de armas, les pido que no le den la espalda al pueblo de Venezuela. No repriman más.
Despite criticisms of an illegitimate election victory, many countries still support Maduro as the current president. Furthermore, the defense minister stated that Venezuela's armed forces do not recognize Juan Guaidó as president. Despite resistance from the military, Guaidó pushed for democratic elections and international aid. Maduro responded by creating blockades at the border to prevent humanitarian aid from coming through. In the middle of these tensions, the clashes between protesters and the military could get increasingly violent. But how did Venezuela go from riches to rags in a few years? And how did the nation end up accused of being a dictatorship? Answering these questions involves understanding political shifts towards totalitarian leadership since Hugo Chavez began his presidency in 1999. Political moves by the Venezuelan government over the last 2 decades comprised a complicated mix of socialist reform for the poor as well as increased nationalization of domestic businesses. Venezuela is one of 14 nations of OPEC, and at one point produced over 10% of the world's crude oil, but many in the country felt they never saw the benefits of the booming oil economy. Chavez built his image around these frustrations. One of Chavez's main goals was to use PDVSA, the largest state oil company, to establish socialist programs that would use the money from the oil company to help the poor. At first, the program showed promise due to record-high oil prices in Venezuela. Around 98% of export profits were from oil revenues, so decreasing poverty levels were largely dependent on the rise of global oil prices. But not everyone was satisfied with Chavez's attempts to further nationalize businesses in the country. Oil executives and workers at PDVSA challenged Chavez's motives to politicize the company, and they decided to strike. In 2003, Chavez fired 19,000 employees, close to half of the workforce from PDVSA, and blacklisted them from future employment in the oil sector. These workers were replaced with employees loyal to his government, and later the government threatened to remove all workers who did not support Chavez. The massive loss in skilled workers triggered a deeper decline in oil production. This incident became one of many that showed that workers were no longer protected by the Constitution against acts of political discrimination. Chavez also prepared Venezuela poorly for its economic future by spending so much of the oil production on welfare programs while failing to reinvest into the same oil companies. The nationalization of businesses began to cripple domestic production. When Chavez came to power, there were more than 800,000 private businesses. Today, fewer than 233,000 remain. In 2004, the Chavez government abandoned their commitment to judicial independence. The assembly then launched a political takeover of the Supreme Court. They enacted a new law expanding the court from 20 to 32 members. This made it possible for Chavez and his supporters in the assembly to pack and purge the Supreme Court. The political takeover of the Supreme Court effectively neutralized the judiciary as an independent branch of government. Chavez cracked down on civil rights, setting precedents that would gradually restrict free speech in Venezuela. He passed a series of laws that included restrictions on freedom of speech, including control of the internet, a virtual ban on the foreign funding of NGOs, and dismissal of legislative officials wishing to switch sides. Chavez also silenced media critics by refusing to renew broadcast licenses of major TV stations in Venezuela.
No se va a tolerar aquí ningún medio de comunicación que esté al servicio del golpismo contra la independencia nacional. Venezuela se respeta.
Chavez's spending put the nation deep in debt, and the national reserves began to decline. Venezuela was on the edge of a resource curse. Failing to diversify new industries and reinvest in oil could collapse the new social welfare programs. And that's exactly what happened. But the social welfare programs wouldn't collapse until after Chavez's death in 2013, when Nicolás Maduro became president. In 2014, oil prices fell globally and government spending became unsustainable. The country's imports decreased dramatically, and the government slashed budgets for maintaining the nation's oil fields. Venezuela's oil production hit a 3-decade low of 1.5 million barrels a day. Maduro could no longer pay for imports, so he started printing money. This triggered massive levels of hyperinflation throughout the country. Maduro also restricted access to foreign currencies. Most Venezuelans were trading bolivars in the black market for US dollars at extremely high rates because they were excluded from official exchange rates that often only military elite and government officials had access to. Many of Maduro's solutions to the economic crisis failed to resolve root issues. The lack of imports combined with a failing local economy resulted in scarcity at grocery stores, often leaving shelves completely empty. The healthcare system was in shambles. At one point, 70% of blood banks didn't have any access to usable blood. Despite this, Maduro refused opportunities from the international community to provide humanitarian aid. His efforts to restore trust in the Venezuelan currency failed. He circulated a new currency after inflation rates skyrocketed, lopping 5 zeros off the bolivar and renaming it the sovereign bolivar. This didn't resolve the problem of inflation, it was a cosmetic fix. The crisis was so bad that Venezuela's homicide and murder rates rose to among the highest in the world. Maduro continued to suppress free speech. Venezuela saw over 70 newspapers, TV, and radio stations close, while attacks and arrests of journalists increased.
I conducted an interview with Nicolás Maduro. I showed him a video that I personally took of 3 kids behind a trash truck looking for food. He didn't want to continue the interview. He tried to close my iPad where I showed him the video, and they confiscated all our cameras, 4 cameras. After 2 hours of being detained, they allow us to leave the presidential palace. I think we'll never have that interview again. They don't want the world to see what we did.
Venezuela is now desperate to strengthen and diversify its domestic industries. But how can this happen with price controls, high inflation rates, the migration epidemic, and the government's takeover of private businesses? Under the leadership of Hugo Chavez and Nicolás Maduro, the accumulation of power in the executive branch and erosion of human rights have enabled the government to intimidate, censor, and punish its critics. Shortages of medical supplies and food have intensified, and weak government responses have undermined Venezuelans' access to food and healthcare. A call to free elections may be Venezuela's best chance at revitalizing basic human rights, which have declined in the last 20 years. What's clear is there's no immediate fix for such a deep political and economic crisis. Perhaps progress towards long-term solutions would come if Maduro steps down and democracy is restored.